All right, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jim Piazza. Dr. Piazza is liberal arts research professor, political science at the Pennsylvania State University. We're actually especially happy to have him here at NYU as he's an alum, completing his PhD in 1999. Since then, he's authored over 30 high-quality publications on terrorism. I'd like to say for any topic on my terrorism syllabus, I could find something authored by Jim to put on there. His research tests theoretical and policy arguments about the causes, practice, and consequences of terrorism. His work has investigated a range of topics, including the economic, social, and political roots of terrorism, the interplay between repression, human rights, and terrorism, the relationship between state weakness and failure in terrorism, and natural resources, and the narcotics trade in terrorism. More recently, he's looking at engagement in criminal activities and how that affects terrorist group longevity, ethnic diaspora groups in terrorism, and foreign military interventions in terrorism. At Penn State, Dr. Piazza teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on terrorism, and he's helping to develop a new counterterrorism option for the online Homeland Security Masters of Professional Studies program. In addition to all these profound achievements, Jim is actually one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, and a truly exceptional colleague. So when I was at Penn State, actually my office was across from him for several years, and I can just tell you there were numerous undergraduate, graduate students going in and out of his office, and he was always, he spent countless hours with them, very patiently and diligently advising him. So I'm thrilled that he's here with us today to present his keynote address, Illiberal Democracy and the Consequences for Terrorism. So a big round of applause. Jim.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for the nice guy comment. I gotta be a jerk or something during Q&A or something like that to kind of balance off from that, to get some respect, I guess. Thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be able to present this to you today as a keynote speaker. The title of the talk is Illiberal Democracy and the Consequences for Terrorism, and it kind of talks about some research that I've published recently and some current research and some current data that I'm looking at, and what I think is kind of a fruitful potential future avenue for terrorism research. Okay, so some of the topics I'm going to talk about today are the following. I'm going to identify some terms. What do we mean by this term illiberal democracy and this related concept called democratic backsliding? And then I ask some questions that get to the heart of some of the empirical analysis that has been done by myself and some others and some ongoing research that I'm doing. Ask the following questions. Are illiberal democratic regimes more prone to terrorism? And is democratic backsliding, this associated concept, is it associated with higher terrorism risks? And then finally, I look at some attitudes about politics and liberal rights, and I try to sort of explore whether or not these might be associated with increased support for terrorism, and then I conclude with some ideas for some future research. So first, let's identify the term I'm talking about, illiberal democracy. It's a term that was not coined by an academic. It was coined by Zakaria, who is a journalist, in his Foreign Affairs piece in 1997, The Rise of a Liberal Democracy. And this sort of takes me back a little while because it came out when I was a grad student at NYU. And I want to kind of paint the picture a little bit for those of you who might not know, and that is, in the 1990s, there was sort of the third wave of democratization that crashed across the world. And what that meant was this huge set of countries transitioned away from mostly communist rule to a more politically open society, right? There's this idea that democracy was spreading around the world, democracy had won, democracy was the future, it was the direction that all regimes eventually were going to move towards. And mostly the definition of what made a country democratic was whether or not its citizens picked its leaders, whether or not elections were held to pick the leaders. And Zakaria was sort of this first sort of commentator out there to look more closely at some of these regimes and notice that though they had democratically selected their leaders in free and fair contests, that lurking below was sort of like a lack of respect for ordinary citizens' rights, or some profoundly undemocratic or illiberal norms, institutions, and practices that sort of characterize these regimes. He was sort of the pin poking a hole in this big, huge, exuberant bubble, in this big, exuberant balloon sort of about how the future was going to be democratic and wonderful, and this was great, right? So he first came up with this idea, the rise of a liberal democracy in foreign affairs, where he identified this. And so for the purposes of this talk, I wanted to sort of identify at least what this first term, at least to me, means, and that is, an illiberal democracy is a political regime in which elections are held. These elections may or may not be free and fair. Frequently, they are free and fair. So the leader is democratically elected in what's a relatively free and clean process. But the regime that comes into power, or the regime that is in power, compromises the civil liberties of civilians. It abrogates rule of law. Minority rights are not respected. In fact, minorities might be demonized. The right to dissent is not respected. The media is trod upon, and the authority of other branches of government, the legislature, the judiciary, are not respected. Typically, the executive holds sway. Right? So again, you have this, what I would call the more photogenic component of democratic rule, which is the election being held, mostly free and fair, but you have the other components, which I think Zakaria correctly identifies as essential to democracy, respect for liberal rights and practices and norms that are not quite there, that are not fully sort of supported, right? There are other terms that are used for a liberal democracy: semi-democracy, an incomplete democracy, what's also called a non-consolidated democracy, the idea that when a country democratizes, there is a period of time in which the institutions and norms and values and practices need to be consolidated. For quantitative political science scholars like myself that look at terrorism, we tend to use these terms anocracy and hybrid regime to capture some of these regimes. And that's because the data we look at sort of identifies regimes by category. You can have this one category called democracy. You can have another category called a non-democracy or an autocracy. It's the idea that there's these regimes that kind of combine features of both. They combine features of democracy and non-democracy into one political regime. We call that anocracy, or a hybrid regime. It's a hybrid because it includes components of democratic and non-democratic rule. So this is sort of the term I'm talking about. And you have a lot of contemporary examples. And that picture's, oh, it's a good picture. So that's Victor Obran, right? You have a lot of contemporary examples I think we all think about when we think about illiberal democracy or non-consolidated democracies. Russia's Putin is perhaps the exemplar here. You have a democratically, you have an elected leader that retains a lot of popular support. If he ran for election tomorrow, he probably could win, right? But of course, rule of law, civil liberties are not respected, minority rights are trampled upon, the media is frightened, journalists disappear, the judiciary is run across, and so on and so forth. Turkey is another example of one of these types of regimes. Erdogan regime. It's an interesting case because, of course, you have a country that has a checkered history with democracy, but it's one in which you have had varying levels of free elections and rights, right? Particularly when Turkey was serious about it, when there was a serious bid for Turkey's membership in the European Union. But under Erdogan, most recently, you of course have an illiberal sort of regime coming into place. The Philippines is a good example where you have a president that is popularly elected and you have democratic rights for some people, but of course it's a policy, it's enacted in the Philippines where you have summary execution of drug dealers and people that are suspected of engaging in the drug trade or drug users themselves. I think I read just on the bus coming up here that the president of the Philippines' approval rating is like 75% or something like that. Presumably he could win an election tomorrow. So it's an elected leader, but again, you don't have sort of due process, rights of the accused, and human rights protections that are essential liberal values. Other examples: Pakistan, Indonesia, Ukraine. Hungary is a good example because it's a regime that sort of starts off as a third wave country, starts off the time period as a democracy being, having a lot of democratic components, but now has a president, Obran here, who actually specifically uses this term illiberal to describe his own regime. In this famous 2014 speech, he says, "The new state we are building is an illiberal state." He goes on in the speech to say, liberal democracy is good. That's a good goal. But there's other goals out there that are good, and that is, for example, building a strong state and building a strong nation, right? So you actually have a leader that uses the descriptor illiberal to describe his own regime and indeed acts accordingly. Okay, so where are these regimes located? Are they on the rise? And so there's a couple tools we can use for this. One is the Freedom House, which is an NGO. You guys probably are aware of them. They do sort of democracy promotion, and they produce a report every year called Freedom in the World, and Freedom in the World report comes out with data and rankings and classifications of countries in terms of how free they are. And as political scientists, we love to kind of hate this data because we don't like any quality data. There's never high enough quality data out there. But I use it here because, again, it produces a nice, interesting map, and it kind of illustrates one of the patterns and concepts I wanted to talk about. So this is a map of regimes based on their categorization in Freedom in the World from Freedom House for 2017. And Freedom House has sort of three basic categories it uses for regimes. That makes it kind of useful in my mind. Traditionally in political science, the tendency has been to look at it in a binary fashion. A country is a democracy, or it's this category we call non-democracy, right? Well, the Freedom of the World report does something a little bit different in that it has three categories. The first are the countries that are in green here, and these are the free countries, the full democracies, the Canadas, US, Switzerland, Sweden, so on and so forth, right? These are the fully free countries according to the two criteria that Freedom House looks at, and that is the quality of respect for and protection of political rights of citizens and civil liberties of citizens, right? Then you have this other, and that's the largest category, and that's sort of a consequence of the waves of democratization. The plurality of countries in the world in 2017, according to Freedom House, are in this category they call free. The smallest category, right, is this category they call unfree. These are the regimes that do not respect political rights and civil liberties, and they're in the smallest category. The medium category in terms of size is this category they call partly free. In 2017, there were 59 countries rated by Freedom House as partly free in terms of political rights and civil liberties, about 30% of the total sample. One thing to understand about Freedom House data is it's pretty sticky. It doesn't change from year to year in terms of category. It's not common for a country in a given year or even a time period to change from free to partly free or not free to free or so on and so forth, right? It's a fairly rare event for a country to change. Yet, in the past 10 years, looking at the data earlier this summer, I noticed that the most dynamic category for Freedom House is this partly free category. 14 countries transitioned just in the past years to this partly free status. Now, some of these countries are countries that were not free, and they're transitioning to being partly free, hopefully on the way to being free. So that's a good development. But actually, the larger number of them are countries that are transitioning from free to partly free. Turkey's an example of this, okay? So this is an interesting sort of category. Looking at it a little more closely, looking at the more subtle changes. Again, remember the data are sticky, and changing of absolute category is rare. I looked at just sort of like indications of countries becoming less liberal during the same time period. And I found there were 59 countries, according to Freedom House data, that saw a reduction in their Freedom House political rights and civil liberty scores. Not reduction, actually, it's increase because the scale is flipped for it. But again, a worsening of their civil liberties or political rights scores. 59 countries, right? And there's some notable cases of regimes among this group that have become less liberal. And you can sort of look at them here. This is, of course, not all 59, but you have countries like Greece and Hungary, Israel, Latvia, Mexico, Taiwan, Turkey, Ukraine, South Korea, South Africa. Many of these countries, of course, have been assumed to have very stable, very strong traditions of liberal democratic rule. But according to Freedom House, they've kind of had a negative change, not enough to maybe necessarily to change categories, but to sort of become less liberal. So there's kind of this phenomenon that's out there. And among the Western democracies, you have similar concerns. Among the most established democracies, you have this concept called democratic backsliding. In June of 2017, Edward Luce is a Financial Times journalist who wrote this book that just came out, good read. It's called The Retreat of Western Liberalism, and he identifies the growth, things that maybe wouldn't be necessarily yet captured by Freedom House data, but the rise in this illiberal populist moment within the Western democracies, right? The growth of illiberal populist politicians, parties, and political movements. And these are manifested in the National Front, for example, in France, the UKIP in the United Kingdom, and Luce, of course, includes Trump's America in this category as well, where you don't have a change in status yet necessarily of the countries, but you have populist politicians winning or coming close to winning on an anti-elite, anti-globalist, anti-immigrant platform, and one that Luce would say is very much based upon a latent skepticism about traditional democratic values or respect for democratic values, right? And sort of he looks at this. Now again, when this book comes out in June 2017, okay, he only knows certain things. He does know that Macron has won the second round of the French presidential election, but he notes that Le Pen that the National Front did better in this last election, even though it lost. It did better in this last election than it's ever done, right? And this is it's sort of a sobering sort of comment here that Luce points out, is he says that think of France right now as a two-party system, two major parties, and one of them is a neo-fascist party. It's a reformed neo-fascist party, and it's not a third party more. It's the second party in France. By the time the book came out, the UKIP had not been slaughtered at the polls in Great Britain, but of course it had been behind the Brexit, and it had sort of lent it seemed to have a lot of support and following because of Brexit. So you have this related concept of something maybe a little more subtle, and that is maybe in a lot of countries where there's traditionally been respect for democratic rights and liberal values, you have a backsliding that's going on. And indeed, in another piece by Roberto Stefan Foa and Yasha Monk that just appeared in the recent edition of Journal of Democracy, Signs of Deconsolidation, you have public opinion data over time, so that seems to sort of indicate the rise of liberal attitudes globally and a democratic skepticism, meaning an increasing questioning of the value of democratic rule within societies. And so what Foa and Monk do, and this has been pretty popularly reported, you may have seen it before if you haven't read the Journal of Democracy issue that it appeared in, is what they've done is that they look at the World Value Survey, which is this global, 40 and 50 and 60 country professionally executed surveys about all different types of opinions, particularly political opinions in countries. And it's been done in waves. And they compared an earlier wave and a later wave in terms of attitudes. The earlier wave that they compared was the wave 3, which was fielded in 1995, 1997, to the 6th wave, the most recent wave, which has been fielded in 2010 to 2014. And they looked at one specific question and responses to the question in the World Value Survey, and that is the support for or affection for a strong leader who does not have to bother with elections. What type of government do you think what would be the best type of government for your country? Some respondents saying a strong leader who does not have to bother with elections. So this is a clearly anti-democratic, anti-liberal opinion that's out there. What you can see here with the chart, and again, they provide a lot of sort of different sets of empirical evidence for this, and I think figure 2 is kind of their punchline here. And figure 2 in their analysis basically shows a bunch of countries, and you see it looks like it's a lighter colored circle, and that is the percentage of respondents in that 1995-1997 wave that say, I support, for my government, my country, a strong leader who does not bother with elections, right? And then the darker circle would be the wave 6, the 2010-2014 responses. For every country you see an arrow pointing to the right, that's an increase in the percentage of people in that country that really support strongman government that does not bother with elections, right? And you can see most of these arrows are pointing to the right in a lot of countries. Russia, of course, is very prominent there. We have a pretty dramatic growth in percentages of people that are supporting such a government. Romania as well, Ukraine, Taiwan, but even Turkey's on there, but even Spain is on there. Japan has got an increase. The United States has got an increase. It's still a minority opinion, but it's grown. And so what Foa and Monk say is that these are opinions that have been stable for a long time, but have now in recent years seen an increase or a spike. They particularly note in other analyses that the skepticism about democracy and affection for alternatives to democracy that are illiberal are particularly pronounced among millennials, among younger voters, okay? Now, I do want to say they're prophets of doom and gloom. I mean, they're saying be very afraid, right? Be alarmed. This is really, really scary. You should really read, if you're interested in this, you should read the entire journal issue of this because they do take on some skeptics. There's other scholars that do research on democracy that quibble with their interpretation of data and meanings of what it means not to support democracy. But again, their take-home point is illiberal attitudes are on the rise globally, including in countries you wouldn't expect them to, including in bastions of democracy. Okay, that's a pretty long-winded wind-up on a terrorism conference here. What the hell does that have to do with terrorism, which is the topic we're all interested in here? So the question I have sort of being interested in and worrying about illiberalism in the world is the question, is a more illiberal world a more terrorism-prone world? And I'll present you some evidence which sort of gives you a very firm answer of maybe. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's the case that we should be worried. There is some evidence I can present to you that illiberal democratic regimes, as a type of regime, experience more terrorism. There's some evidence I can show you that the growth of a liberal democracy and democratic backsliding increases terrorism. And I also look at some public opinion data to show that people with a liberal public opinion attitudes are also more likely to support or be tolerant of or support terrorism and political violence. Let's kind of do that. But before I do that, I need to talk about some research to date. Whenever I talk about these kind of things, I get the same sort of, in terms of empirical research in in terms of empirical research on terrorism, probably no relationship has been examined more thoroughly, or at least with a lot of studies, I guess, than the relationship between democracy and terrorism. It's been kind of the hallmark of what we looked at. And so people say, sweet Jesus, do we need yet another study of democracy and terrorism? Don't we know what we need to know about that? Is there a reason to do more? And I argue that there is one, right? The terrorism literature on democracy looks like this. Lots been written on it, but there's sort of several kind of key findings that I think are important for what I want to talk about here. The first is, it seems to be that regime type matters, at least in the simplest linear studies, empirical studies. Democracies statistically experience more terrorist activity. But other research has shown that there's sort of, this is complicated, right? Really it is specific types of democracies. Joe Eierman has a 1998 piece that I think is horribly undercited and underappreciated, did a follow-up study to it, which I'm sure will be as horribly underappreciated, but it's a study here that kind of shows that you really have to look very closely at the quality of democratic regimes to kind of identify which types experience more terrorism. It really is the recently transitioned regimes, the recently transitioned democracies are the ones that sort of are more prone to terrorist activity, experiencing statistically significantly more terrorist activity. The analysis that I've done extends this, that shows that it's really younger democracies, right? The younger the democracy, the less, sort of institutionalized democratic practices are. These are the ones that experience more terrorism, more so than the established democracies, more so than autocracies, right? So again, democracy seems to produce more terrorism, but what type of democracy? Specific type. And then finally, there's research that kind of shows that components and institutional features of democracy have different effects on terrorism. So again, looking at specific components, elements of democracy is also quite fruitful. That's something that we need to kind of pay attention to. Okay, let me transition here to a recently published piece that I think sort of illustrates some of this, and that is a piece that Todd Sandler and Khusrav Gaibolov and I have recently published, and again, we sort of tried to retackle this whole idea about regime types and terrorism, and this is sort of our recent product here. What we did is we wanted to do two things. We wanted to do a more comprehensive analysis using multiple sources of data, multiple estimation techniques, different samples, different temporal samples, all different types of things to kind of identify the relationship between the type of political regime a country has and the amount of terrorism it experiences statistically. But we started off theorizing something a little bit different. We wanted to have 3 different regime types. We thought that that was the most appropriate way to look at it. And theoretically, here's why we did this. Our theory was that the full-fledged democracies, right, the Switzerlands, the Swedens, they should experience very little terrorism. They should be able to reduce terrorism by providing better political access to would-be terrorists, to dissidents, by managing political conflict better, by protecting people's lives and property, and by being incentivized to do so. We observed that politicians in these countries lose their jobs if they cannot do this. And by engaging in more competent counterterrorism, we think that this is something that's a feature of the economic robustness of their economies and the strength of their states and their ability to channel resources towards competent counterterrorism. So we really expected that the established democracies would experience less terrorism. On the other hand, we thought the autocracies would experience less terrorism because they could just simply crush any and all dissidents. They can eliminate by force, and they're not inhibited about doing this, eliminating any challengers, any rivals, any autonomous political behavior, whether it's violent or not, including terrorism, will be crushed by autocracies, and their policing regime is uninhibited, right? Really, it's in these middling regimes, these anocracies that combine both autocratic and democratic features that we should experience the highest levels of terrorism, and indeed, that's what we found. This is just one graphical representation of one of our statistical models. On the x-axis here, what you see, our independent variable here is just a measurement of regime type. We use this Polity 2 score. I think many of us are familiar with what Polity 2 is. In case you're not, it's just a quantitative measurement scale for measuring how democratic a country is, what type of regime it has. And we just normalized it here for the purpose of this graph between 0 and 1. Right? And then, of course, on the y-axis here are the predicted, given our statistical model, the predicted number of terrorist events that a country is going to experience. And we looked at all types of terrorism: domestic, transnational, ambiguous versus unambiguous terrorism. It didn't really matter. The same pattern kept emerging, the same inverted U pattern, whereby on the 0 level of the scale, those are the North Koreas, you don't see a lot of terrorism, right? Controlling also for the quality of press freedom and press coverage in those countries, which is very, very important. On the level of the one side, right, you have the Switzerlands, the Swedens, the Denmarks, the Norways, the Icelands, the other countries that are full-fledged democracies. They also experience the least amount of terrorism. It really is in the regimes that appear between about the 0.3 and the 0.7, 0.8 level, the anocracies, where you see more terrorism. So that was one kind of a sort of clue to me. That what got me thinking about this result was, if I'm interested in a liberal democracy, are liberal democracies populating some of these areas here underneath the inverted U, right? Is it the case that a similar sort of dynamic is at play here that can kind of shed light? Do a liberal democracy specifically, we didn't really look at a liberal democracy, we looked at anocracies in this last analysis, right? What about a liberal democracy specifically? Do they experience more terrorism than other types of regimes? So I did some analysis, and working on this now. It is preliminary, but I did some preliminary data looking at the SIRI database. The SIRI is the Sigrinelli and Richards database. It's an open source database that basically looks between 1981 and the most recent year it's updated. It sort of assesses the quality of civil liberties, political rights, and human rights within countries using NGO reports. Right, how widespread is their repression of, or how widespread is their tolerance of human rights and other types of freedoms that people enjoy, these liberal freedoms, right? So I used that data on a sample of 170 countries, and I wanted to look only post 9/11. I looked at 2001 to 2012, for which I had covariates for. I actually ran the analysis going back to 1981, which is the beginning of the SIRI data, and the same result was produced. I just thought it was maybe more salient to look at post 9/11 terrorism. You can make an argument that terrorism has changed over time, of course, and I wanted to look at more contemporary threats. And I identified 3 different types of regimes here for this data. One I called a liberal democracy. And the liberal democracies are coded as follows. These are regimes that allow electoral self-determination. They allow their people to pick their leaders in a free and fair way. These are elected leaders. But there is restriction to a moderate or high degree of one or more of the following: freedom of association, judicial independence, the independence of the judiciary from the executive, freedom of movement, both domestically and internationally, religious freedom, freedom of speech, tolerance and respect for workers' rights to collectively bargain and form unions, and freedom also from physical abuse. This would be freedom, again, from being tortured, politically imprisoned, disappeared, and so on, right? So again, a liberal democracy allows elections in a free and fair way, but restricts one or more of the following. Contrasted with another type of regime I call liberal democracy, which basically allows electoral self-determination, and all other types of rights and freedoms are not abridged. From autocracy, this is a type of regime that allows neither electoral nor other types of rights and freedoms. In these models, I do a pretty simple set of controls. I control for past terrorist activity. Some countries are just more prone to having more terrorism, so I lagged the terrorism variable and put on the right-hand side. I looked also at population and the level of economic development through GDP of the country. I also lagged all variables by one period so that to try to kind of parse out some of the causal direction. And I also played around with some other controls that didn't disrupt the results. This is the most stripped down results. And what you see here are the substantive effects of these models, the substantive findings using marginal effects simulations, right? You have a baseline here of all countries. In the sample, the typical country, irrespective of its regime type at all, or the quality of liberal governance within the country, experienced about 2.3 terrorist attacks. That doesn't sound like a lot, but again, terrorism is a rare event, right? One terrorist attack can be kind of a big deal. All countries predicted to experience about 2.3 attacks. Autocracies do better, as predicted by Sandler and Khusrav, right? As Todd and Khusrav. The autocracies experience about 1.5 terrorist attacks per time period, right? The liberal democracies do even better. They're even better at sort of counterterrorism, 1.2 attacks. Look at the liberal democracies, holy cow, right? 8.8 attacks predicted, right? So again, these are the type of, this is something that kind of caught my eye here. And this is really a subset of sort of regime out there that I think is kind of important, particularly if it's growing in prominence in the world, or potentially could grow in prominence in the world. What about backsliding? The results are a little bit more murky, but there's some results that are there. This would be the change in the democracy score, asking the question, does actual democratic backsliding stimulate more terrorism? And what I have here, I use a little bit of different data here. I use data from the polyarchy data, and we all have access to this as researchers, as scholars. It's less used in political science, but it's more attuned to shorter term change than, let's say, the polity data here. And they actually have a measure called liberal democracy with the polyarchy data. And this liberal democracy would be able to pick up changes not only in things like elections, but other liberal rights that are as well within the quality of liberal governance within a country. So this is a measure. My independent variable here is the change in the polyarchy score reducing from democracy. Samples 172 countries, 2001 to this longer time series, 2016. And you can see here in this data, the average country experiences more terrorism, 6.8 attacks. The countries in which the democracy score doesn't change, they stay strong democracies, experience 6.5, a little bit less, but not statistically significantly less. It's not statistically significantly less. The countries in which annually the democracy score is declining is experiencing more, 7.52 attacks. This is not that much larger than all countries, but it is statistically significant. And again, this is the measurement here is an annual change. So again, some evidence here about democratic backsliding and the risk of terrorist activity from countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding. What about attitudes? I'm going through this thing now where I'm interested in public opinion. It's hard actually to research public opinion on terrorism because it's hard to ask people what they think about terrorism in public opinion polls. But I've sort of played around with some World Values Survey data from the third wave that it's 1995, 1997, not 1993, 1995. But the third wave of the World Values Survey data includes one measly question. It's kind of a crappy question, but no other World Survey data actually asks a question about political violence. It asks respondents, as one of the many questions that are in the survey, about their level of support for, quote, using violence to, what they think about the statement, using violence to achieve political goals is justified. This is the closest thing in world values we have to a question about terrorism. So I look at that, I operationalize that as my dependent variable in this analysis, and I look at sort of two components that I've talked about so far with this worry about the growing illiberal democratic threat. I look at skepticism about democracy, and I also look at a question of tolerance. Sort of recall, Luce identifies in the growth of a liberal populism in established democracies, that the issue of tolerance of minorities, tolerance of immigrants, attitudes about people who are different are a key component of the appeal of these political figures and political parties. Think about the National Front and Donald Trump, right? And also sort of tolerance and intolerance is very, very important here. So I focus on that from the World Values Survey data. And I I only looked at the democracies and the anocracies, so I removed all of the respondents from this analysis that lived in a non-democratic regime just to test it. And it's a lot of data. It's 30,000 respondents here. I did robustness checks only on the respondents also of democracies, and just the anocracies produces the same result. And I have some what I think are pretty standard controls. I control for the income of the respondent, their level of education, their employment status, their gender, the marital status, their level of religiosity, self-reported, and their political ideology. In other work that I've done with this data, I've thrown a lot of attitudinal stuff in there. I've also looked at their level of life satisfaction, how authoritarian they are as a personality type, and things like that. I wanted to give you the most stripped down analysis here and show you what I found. And here's sort of the results. So they're all statistically significant. This shows you graphs of marginal effects of the results of these analyses. And they basically show you for each of the questions about democratic skepticism and tolerance, respondents that are sort of responding in the affirmative, how much more likely they are to support the statement using political violence for political goals is justified. So I looked at sort of two different measures of democratic skepticism. The first one is respondents that are replying in the affirmative that believe under a democracy, the economy is worse. Democracies have worse economic performance than other countries. The reason I wanted to look at this specific question as a measure of skepticism about democracy is because in the most recent 2017 Luce book, he actually identifies as a root cause, a root core driving factor for the popularization, for how popular these illiberal populist political movements and parties are, is a profound a feeling, particularly among the middle class of these countries, that of economic distress. Specifically, that they do not expect their children to lead an economically successful life as they have, that there's not been sort of this generational growing in economic expected outcomes. And so what's very, and I'm a big skeptic about this kind of stuff, but I wanted to kind of look at this. I thought it was a pretty interesting result. Is it the case that people who are skeptical about democracy because of the level of economic performance they assign to democracy? Is that what's driving support for political violence? And it seems to be it is statistically significant. Respondents who say, I think that democracy is not a good form of government because the economy is worse, are 4.8% more likely to say using violence for political goals is justified, statistically significant. You have a statistically significant but smaller result for people that say that democracies are indecisive. They're just squabbling. You know, I guess how would you say in the United States? We need to shake it up. We need to shake up Washington. I've always been very nervous by that phrase. I don't really know what shake it up means, right? You know, we need to shake up Washington, D.C. The politicians just talk. They're not very decisive. They're indecisive. Respondents who agree with that were 1.5% more likely to support exhibit support for violence for political goals is justified. The other two measures look at tolerance. They're even more sort of robust here. One of them is more robust. And that is one of the ways that survey researchers look at how tolerant a respondent is, rather than asking them, are you racist or are you tolerant? They ask you, who would you want or not want as a neighbor? Okay, that's a very standard tool that's used to sort of determine tolerance here. And respondents that say, I would not want a neighbor of a different race, 5.3% more likely to support political violence, right? Those that say, I don't want an immigrant neighbor, I don't want someone from another country as a neighbor, 4.4% more likely to support political violence. I actually looked at, there's multiple measures in the World Values Survey about tolerance, and I created an index for it, same type of result. I looked at, actually every measure of intolerance is a pretty good statistically significant predictor of support for political violence. People that don't want gay people as a neighbor, people that say, I don't want someone of a different political ideology as me as my neighbor, I want my neighbors to think the way I do politically. All of these were statistically significant predictors of support for terrorism and political violence, for the statement using violence for political goals is justified. That's kind of not a great question. I think all of us would agree that political violence and terrorism might not be the same thing. In fact, I was joking with Joe at lunch that when people, he sort of advised, when people ask you, what do you study and what do you do, say you study political violence, not terrorism, otherwise you'll get an earful, right? People clearly kind of, maybe their mind doesn't go to the same place when they heard the term political violence, but it's kind of hard to ask people in a survey whether they support terrorism, what they think about terrorism. And so, oh, I'm sorry. Wow, what am I doing? This is just the results from the World Value Survey. This just shows you the total results here, right? So this shows you the size of the impact in terms of increasing support for political violence, and this shows you the total level you can see here. Again, all of these blue bars here are larger than the baseline. Good news is only 18.3% of the respondents say that they support political violence, which I think is good news. It does vary a little bit by country, but again, the democratic skeptics and the intolerant respondents were more likely to support political violence. Again, getting back to that question, not a great question to ask about terrorism. So I've been working with some other data from the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer is it's an NGO, it's a partnership between American universities that do survey research and universities in the Arab world, teaming up to get some pretty comprehensive and pretty rich public opinion data about what people in Arab countries think about their world, think about their life and politics and religion, all types of stuff. In the first wave of this survey, it was fielded in 2006, gleaning from that about 3,000 respondents that were located in Algeria, Bahrain, Jordan, Lebanon, and the Palestinian territories. There was a relatively good question that gets, I think, better at this idea about whether or not the respondent supports something we call terrorism. And that is a question asking, do you agree with the following statement? Armed groups are justified in attacking civilians in Iraq in order to resist the American occupation. That's not the way I probably would have phrased it, right? But I think it gets us at something that's kind of interesting. Again, the context here in 2005, 2006 is the American occupation of Iraq. That's important. But you have armed movements, jihadi movements, you have Iraqi indigenous insurgent movements that are attacking military and civilian targets within Iraq. One of the, of course, key components, some people think that an important definitional component of what terrorism is it specifically targets civilians. This gets at that as well. I think it's a little bit better of a, not great, but a little bit better of a question to sort of suss out whether the respondent is likely to be more tolerant of terrorism. I think that that's important because, of course, we know that toleration of terrorism, public support for terrorism is important for terrorist movements. And in Arab Barometer, there's other data, there's other questions in there that I transform into 3 independent variables. One asks respondents whether or not they think that violation of human rights within their country is justifiable to preserve security. I would argue that people that answer in the affirmative are expressing an illiberal point of view. The second is, of course, the same battery of tolerance that I was in the World Values Survey. I just combined all these together. Respondents that say, I don't want to live next door to a member of a different to someone of a different race, a person of a different religion, or a foreigner. And then the third is a great question that was asked, not asked in World Values, but asked for Arab Barometer, which was, do you agree with the following statement? A strong, non-democratic leader that does not bother with parliament and elections is a good or very good way of governing a country, right? So that's important to use. In this analysis, I control for some pretty standard things: family income decile, the employment status of the respondent, the marital status, their gender, their age, their education level, and their level of religiosity. I forgot to include, I also control for whether or not they were Sunni or Shia, because, of course, there's a sectarian component to the Iraq conflict. And these are the results that I produce here. The good news is, on average, only about 13.9% of the respondents agree at all, or just in general agree with, think it's good, they support armed groups attacking civilians in Iraq. So this is definitely a minority opinion in the Arab world, which I think is very good, of course. But the other measures of illiberal attitudes are larger, right? People that hold the attitude that violation of human rights is justifiable are statistically small, but statistically significantly more likely to support attacks against civilians in Iraq. People that say, I don't want to live next to a person of a different race, religion, or a foreigner are more likely to as well. But look at that. The strong, non-democratic leader, right, that doesn't bother with these things called elections, much, much more likely to support attacks against Iraq. Now, this has been sort of a big obsession of mine. I'm working on a paper right now looking at this. There's also other questions in the Arab Barometer that get at this. There's a question that asks, are you skeptical about democracy because the economic performance is poor? That's asked. Democracies don't foster order as well. They're indecisive. Those are in there. There's a question also in there that I don't like democracy because it's kuffar. I don't like democracy because it represents a Western non-Islamic intrusion. Okay? So I've also analyzed those. All forms of democratic skepticism, including the democracies kuffar, all predict the respondents' support for attacks against Iraq, and all about at the same levels. I don't think this is just like rejection of a Western idea. I don't think that's what it is. Maybe better research can kind of get at that, but I'm not seeing a pattern I would think would be conducive to that. Okay, so here are my conclusions, tentative conclusions. Illiberal democracies do seem to be more terrorism prone, at least with the preliminary analysis that I've done. Moreover, countries experiencing a decline in illiberal democratic rule, democratic backsliding, also seem to be more terrorism prone. More work is needed on this. Both of these types of countries may be increasing globally. They seem to be, right? They seem to be an increasingly trajectory of the world. People with illiberal attitudes, particularly skepticism about democracy and lack of tolerance, also seem to be more supportive of the use of political violence. Are such people increasing? Well, Foe and Monk think so, right? Their research suggests these attitudes are becoming more common, right? Which should sort of be a cause for alarm in terms of terrorist activity. Here's what I think we could do next. Here's what I think the future research directions are. First is kind of a giveaway here. That's we need a full empirical investigation, right? We need really a full empirical and robust battery of tests, about what particularly democratic backsliding. My weakest results here, right, including tests of specific components. I've only presented to you the most aggregate, the most basic measure of what democratic backsliding could be. There could be individual components that are important, probably certain types of components of political life are more likely to experience backsliding than others. We should look at all of those. So really need a full investigation of that. The attitudes. Good longitudinal studies on the liberal attitudes would be very helpful, right? This would be something that's important. I mean, you don't have really great questions. And again, it's hard to ask those questions. And you don't have longitudinal studies that can show change over time. I'm going to chuckle again here because my lunch companions and I were laughing and were denigrating sort of we were bemoaning the fact that it's harder and harder for us to publish because you get all these smart-ass reviewers that are saying things like, you know, what about if you really parsed out causal inference here? Have you done good tests of sort of causation here? And maybe you need an experiment, and actually I wrote this before I had lunch, but yeah, we need experimental research. I really think here that experimental designs, at least in terms of attitudes, would be useful here. Right? It really could be a lot to learn with sort of running experimental subjects to sort of test them on measures of liberal attitudes and support for political violence. A better understanding of the causal process that still is quite ambiguous here. And then finally, once we do all those things, a better investigation, an in-depth investigation on how extremist groups might exploit these. If illiberalism is truly growing, what might we expect extremist movements to do in terms of exploit it? Thank you.